Welcome to the Alexander Society. This is a podcast where we talk about history and actually plan out our introduction so it doesn't sound long and awkward. I'm your host, Derek, the Society's curator, joined by my esteemed colleague and co host, our Commissioner of Refreshments, Tim. How you doing, Tim?
I'm doing pretty good, Derek. How about yourself?
We sound way too cheery for this. Does this sound fake to you?
We're just ready to get drunk, Derek. This is our one time every 2 weeks to have an excuse to drink together over the internet.
Yeah. I'm excited because all of my lefty friends I've been getting a lot of positive reception from Tim. What are you drinking?
So I am drinking Mars Zen by Neff. It's a German style amber lager.
Mm-hmm. I'm already on board.
It's that same. It was that same company that did those Pride beers that I gave you a couple of.
Oh, those were so good.
Well, this is only the second beer I've even seen from them. Uh, Granted, I haven't gone into that liquor store too often, so fair, at least recently. And then I asked the lady for a recommendation on rum because I'm like, I haven't gotten rum on the podcast, and I know you're a big fan, so I was trying to find me a rum that I liked. So she recommended the Scarlet Ibis. It's a Trinidad rum. I don't know what that means.
It means it's from Trinidad.
I probably could have made that conclusion, but I thought it was like a type of rum, not like a location. No, I meant like
Oh yeah, it's probably not from Trinidad, but yeah, it's probably like the style of rum they make in Trinidad.
I didn't even make that connection. I just thought it was like maybe like a try, like how some whiskeys will be blended with multiple ones. I thought maybe it was something like that or something completely different. Like there was something like maybe it was just well, not necessarily distilled, but you know what I mean. Like it had like some kind of three thing in it, but it makes sense that it's from Trinidad. What about yourself, Derek? What are you drinking tonight?
Uh I'm just dipping back into the stock. I didn't get anything new because I'm saving up money for something at the moment. So I pulled out the Pendleton whiskey from a couple episodes ago. That real manly man Western style whiskey. That boy, it's whiskey. That one. And for my drink, for my sipper, I got the that Sapporo that I've just been sitting on for a while because I don't really like it. It's not very good.
You need to dig into those beers I gave you if you still have any left.
Oh, I've already drank most of them. I drink most of them off
I
because
gave it to you so you could give it your side on
yeah, I
taste.
know. I'm sorry. We my my dad just got like a pellet smoker and he's been making a bunch of like smoked meats with it, and every time I eat smoked meats, I got to have a beer with it. So, in this our illustrious society, we have an inconsistent set of rules, which changes from episode to episode.
The first rule for today's episode is every time that something bad happens to Lucy, we shall take 3 sips. What's that second rule, Derek?
Rule number two, every time there's a labor action, we take a shot.
And every time the cops, the government, or strike breakers lose, we'll do what, Derek?
We'll take a shot.
Oh, we didn't take our beginning of the show shot, Derek.
Oh, shit. Yeah, you're right. Well, I've already got mine ready.
So have I. Cheers.
Prost. So, when we left off, 5 of the Haymarket defendants had just become martyrs for the cause of labor, 4 of them by hanging and 1 by suicide. And as Lucy's husband, Albert, was hanged by the state, the police had stripped her naked and held her in a cold cell. We left off on that gem from
Yeah, because she had broken into a meeting, not a meeting hall or a speaking hall of some kind that she had rented out, or am I thinking?
no. No, that yeah, you're thinking from earlier, like during her speaking tour. This was just when she was taking her kids to go and see Albert before his execution. She was just trying to take them to the jail, and instead of letting her see him, they just stripped her naked and threw her in a jail cell.
That's some bullshit.
Yeah, Chicago's finest. Lucy was understandably distraught at the death of her husband. Over the next few days, thousands of people visited the Parsons apartment to view Albert's body and to pay respects. And
That's something I never thought of. That they would give back the body after like a execution. I've always kind of thought it like, oh, they have control of the body the whole time. I don't know why, but I just always kind of thought of it like that.
yeah, I always kind of assumed it was because like once the execution's done, they've paid their debt to paid their debt to society, quote unquote. And so once that's done, like the body is free. The body isn't being the body is an obligation to be held by the state. The state will just give back to the family. Yeah. Yeah. So thousands of people were visiting the Parsons apartment to view Albert's body. Like they just set up a line, and just thousands of people were passing through their like tiny little shitty working class apartment to go and view his body in its casket. And just for several days after the execution, just thousands of people constantly like rolling through.
Well, I mean, it like you said, he was a martyr. Like, of course they're going to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, like one of the most beloved men in Chicago, at least from like the majority, not like the rich assholes, but like the majority of the like working class people of Chicago like adored him, and almost all of them came out to come and view his body. As they did, a lot of people were noting that Lucy was pretty emotionally unstable. She was flip flopping between being inconsolable and sobbing, or just like stoic coldness, just no emotion on her face. And the whole time for the viewing, anybody who would listen, she was cursing the police. She was she was not letting up on telling people how much she hated the police and how much she wanted to get back at them.
In her shoes, I can't say I would do anything else. It's my stereotypical can you blame her at this point with the shit she's been through.
Oh yeah. A funeral procession was held on November 13th, just a couple days after the executions. The permit for the march didn't allow banners, flags, speeches, or music.
That's some bullshit.
Yeah, it's some bullshit. And also, the city didn't allow the five men to be buried within city limits.
Oh, okay. Fuck Chicago.
Yeah, fuck Chicago.
All my homies hate Chicago.
The procession began at Albert Spee's house, and it passed by the homes of each of the men, picking up the caskets as they went. Between 250,000 and 5,000 people crowded into the streets to watch the procession. So that's like 80 or 90% of the entire city coming out to watch the procession. Lucy was following the procession in a carriage with her friend Lizzie Holmes.
Holy shit, they pulled out all the stops for this.
Yeah, it's I can't even imagine what a procession like that would look like, because they can't sing, they can't chant, they can't have banners. Basically, it's just
It's just a somber walk.
yeah, basically. The procession led to the train depot, which would then take the bodies as well as the mourners out of the city to a cemetery just outside city limits called Waldheim Cemetery. 15,000 people packed onto these trains. So many people packed onto the trains that they had to get a second train.
Holy crap.
Yeah, they had only set up for one train, and so many people came that they had to get a second train. When they arrived at the cemetery, several members of the International Working People's Association and the Knights of Labor spoke. When William Black, the defense attorney, came up to speak, he was the defense attorney for the Haymarket defendants. He said, "Quote: We do not stand beside felons consigned to an unglorious tomb. We are here by the bodies of men who were sublime in their self-sacrifice, and for whom the gibbet assumed the glory of a cross."
Fuck, is that eloquent?
Yeah. This guy, William Black, is a fascinating guy. He was a veteran of the Civil War, and he received the Medal of Honor for his actions in combat. And then after the Civil War, he went to law school and he became a lawyer in Chicago and became an activist for progressive causes.
Am I right to assume he fought for the North?
Yes, yeah, he did. The South didn't have the Medal of Honor.
I I'm not too familiar with what awards were given at the time.
Yeah, the Medal of Honor was originally created by. It was actually created by Lincoln during the Civil War.
Oh wow, interesting.
Yeah, that's when they first. And back then they handed it out like candy. Like it wasn't like exactly like a special thing. Like all of the soldiers on the honor guard for Lincoln's funeral received the Medal of Honor.
Oh, so it was just your generic here's an award.
Yeah, but he actually got it for he did some like heroic shit at was it I think it was like the Battle of Andersonville or something like that. I can't remember what, but so at the funeral, the five men, their coffins were draped with red banners, and Albert was buried with a red banner that Lucy had hand sewn and carried at several marches.
Fuck, that's beautiful to be honest.
Yeah, it's and like even today, like leftists, they take their banners pretty seriously. That like their flags and stuff.
I would have never guessed, but it makes sense. Like I had I don't have a whole lot of information on this kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, some do, some don't give a shit, but it depends. But back then, like especially back then in the socialist movement, flags were
Very important.
yeah, they were not quite to like the worship level that like the American flag has, but like if you're a socialist and you saw a red banner, like it meant something. It had meaning. So the bodies were placed in a temporary vault before being buried in their own graves a month later on December 18th, 1887. Before the martyrs could even be interred in their final resting place, Lucy and Lizzie published a book with a collection of Albert's writings on it, on writings in it. Just he was writing essays and stuff. The book was called Anarchism: Its Philosophy and Scientific Basis.
Have you given it a read?
I have not. No, I did not. I didn't know it existed until I did this research. But I'll probably give it a read at some point. But I haven't done a lot of political reading since I started the podcast. Since I spend so much time.
Doing podcast reading?
Yeah,
Fair.
the book was published both in English and in German, and it sold 300 copies before the rest of the copies were seized by the police. Of course.
I mean, that tracks. I mean, it honestly does. I'm not surprised the government seized it.
Yeah, that's the least bad thing the police have done so far.
Yeah, I'd say that counts as it's not a as bad as enough to say it's a shot, but they did something bad. I mean, that's something bad that happened to Lucy because they seized her book from her. So that's just one sip though, because it's not like on the scale of what they've been doing.
Yeah,
I was also starting to talk about last week's rule because I think we had a shot for every time the government does something bad or something, or was it 5 sips?
I think it was like 5 sips.
Okay.
In the introduction of the book, Lucy wrote, quote, "And now I speak as one who knows and has the right to speak. No nobler, purer, truer, more unselfish man ever lived than Albert R. Parsons. And when he and his comrades were sacrificed on the altar of class hatred, the people of the 19th century committed the hideous crime of strangling their best friend. Fraternally yours, Lucy E. Parsons."
That is beautiful.
Yeah. She was such a good writer and speaker. She was so good at stringing together a sentence. And it's a big reason why she was so popular and why she got so big. She could captivate a crowd and she could drive a crowd to do anything she wanted. And the articles and
Oh, so like, pardon the interruption. This is actually kind of interesting. Did you know that when something like like if rioting breaks out, it psychologically each person who joins, um, they're more normal, quote unquote speaking. Like uh, the last person to draw. to like join a riot will be like your like Flanders. Like it literally like just a tiny little bit step of like more normal person each time, and eventually you'll get even the people like who shouldn't be in a riot because it's just like the chaos consumes everyone. They've done studies.
Oh yeah, yeah. You could see that during like during the George Floyd protests. You started seeing like at the start of the protest, it was like just a bunch of masked up lefties and like BLM activists, and then as the protest went on further and further, day after day, you started seeing more of like more just like normal looking schlubs coming out and starting to do the same stuff until at one point in I think it was in Seattle, there were like suburban moms that were coming out with like leaf blowers and they were blowing away tear gas and stuff.
Yeah, it's just like, and it's not even like, even if it's not even just like in the organized way where they're like fighting like the very obvious tyrannical oppression that's happening against the protests. Like a lot of those protests were peaceful, and then they were like, we don't want to deal with this social issue, so we're gonna like disrupt it, and we're gonna do really tyrannical shit to disperse it. Like it just like it's a compounding effect. They've done like psychological studies on it. It's just it fascinates me.
I actually have stats on it.
Oh, you do? Wow.
Stats on like violence at the George Floyd protests. 7% of those protests, uh, 7% involved some sort of violence or property damage by protesters. 54% involved some sort of anti riot response from the police.
That tracks.
Yeah.
That does not surprise me in any way whatsoever. Um,
Yeah. The whole summer of 2020 was just police departments all over the country just throwing tear gas and beating down protesters just for mostly just like standing around and chanting and stuff. By the start of by the start of 1888, Lucy was back to business. The radicals of Chicago had been dealt a severe blow by the deaths of the five of their best organizers, and Lucy found herself having to pick up a lot of the slack. In March 1888, she went to the East Coast for a brief speaking tour. And when she returned to Chicago, she spent some time selling copies of that book I just mentioned, Anarchism. Just she was just going down the street like selling them. While that was happening, she was arrested twice for doing that.
does that surprise me? No.
The first time she was fined $5, and the second time she got a more reasonable judge who agreed to dismiss the charges on the condition that he be allowed to take one of the books so that he could read it for himself.
Interesting.
Which is okay. Okay.
Does it ever come back on how the judge felt about the book or
I didn't find anything about it. Um,
dang. I kind of hoped it would be funny if it radicalized the judge. That'd be amazing.
yeah, a judge realizing that his job is evil. That'd be a that'd be a crazy. I say evil. It's more complicated than that, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. It's like you're trying to do something what you perceive good in a flawed and perfect system. That's kind of how like right before I decided I didn't want to go into law enforcement, I kind of viewed law enforcement. You're trying to make good within a system you know is bad.
That was something bad that happened to Lucy. You want to go ahead and...
Three sips.
So Lucy, she's doing all right raising her children on her own. She was pulling overtime in her dressing business, and at the time she was getting about $12 a week from this organization called the Pioneer Aid and Support Association, which was like it was a charity group that was established to give aid to families who had had their income affected because they're because the man of the house was involved in like the labor movement. So if a if a worker was killed at a strike or they're fired and blacklisted and couldn't find work, then the Pioneer Aid...
Basically, exactly what happened to Lucy.
Yeah. Yeah. So if something like that happens, then the Pioneer Aid Society will just will have a fund and be able to give money. And it's an indictment of the times that it was such a common thing that it required a whole charity organization to fill that niche.
It's sad that it had to happen. Yeah.
So that Lucy, she's doing a good job like taking care of her kids, but this is one of like my criticisms of Lucy, and it's gonna come back in a big way. Yeah, so this is one of my big criticisms that of Lucy, uh, that is gonna come back in a really big way later on. She had a really bad tendency to use her kids as props.
I hate people who do that. That's one of my pet peeves. Like, is just using your kids as like either a shield or like as a way to gain leverage.
Yeah, she was really a person that probably shouldn't have had a family because she was just too far dedicated to her political work. And so like when she would be she would be out on the street, she'd be giving speeches and stuff, and she would have like her kids up there with her, and to just to make a point, she would like point at her son and yell that she was teaching him to hate cops and that she was raising him up to take the fight to police when he grew up.
Okay, even if you believe that, don't announce it to the world so they know who to fucking watch.
Yeah, and a lot of the people in the a lot of the people who would be listening to her would noted that whenever she did this, he Albert very much appeared like terrified and scared that so much attention was being drawn to him, and that his mother was so angry and that he was the center of it.
Can you blame the kid? It's just a kid who's having to deal with all this shit or whatever. It's just that's a lot to put on a child. Is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, it ended up really messing him up later in life. It it was not good for their relationship, and it wasn't good for his health either.
I can't imagine it being good for his health.
So, in the aftermath of the Haymarket executions, the Chicago labor movement became somewhat listless. So, men like Parsons and August Spies were experts at rallying huge masses of people with their speeches behind a like getting them behind a common cause. It going out, working the crowd, rallying riling them up into a frenzy. But now with some of their best speakers gone, uh, the movement was left to men like this guy named Thomas Morgan. Thomas Morgan had been largely uninvolved in the socialist scene since the collapse of the Socialistic Labor Party back in 1881, but he re entered the scene to fill the void left by the Haymarket Eight. Morgan began to work with the remnants of the SLP that were left in the city, and he publicly denounced the actions of. He became like an anti-anarchist crusader.
What?
He called anarchist Yeah, he called anarchist traitors to the socialist cause because he was a reformist. He still believed in like the SL.
Oh, he believed in working with the system.
Yeah, uh he believed that electing socialist delegates and making alliance with mainstream parties was how socialism was going to advance in the United States.
Fat lot of good that's done us.
At the same time, the new leadership of the Chicago anarchists, especially guys like George Schilling and John Joe Buchanan, were spending less time riling up the masses for direct action, and were spending more time contributing to campaigns for Democratic candidates, which is not a very anarchist thing to do.
No, not at all.
Yeah, and like during 1880, during the year of 1888, the a lot of like George Schilling and Joe Buchanan, like their main thing that they were organizing for was tariff reform. That was their big, not any labor cause, tariff reform.
And they still expected us to believe that they were true socialists.
It's yeah,
To be fair, this was the early days and they blah blah blah. It doesn't.
yeah. So by the end of 1888, almost all of the radical energy had gone out of the labor movement. That wouldn't last though. But we're gonna bounce back. All wasn't lost for anarchism in Chicago. In December of 1888, Lucy had just returned from a trip to England, where she had spoken at an assembly of the British Socialist League. While she was in London, she met prominent socialist figures like William Morris, who was the intellectual leader of social democracy and British and like agrarianism in Great Britain. And she also met Peter Kropotkin, who is one of my favorite theorists. I love his work. One of the most influential works to me personally has been a work by Kropotkin called Mutual Aid, and he was a Russian nobleman who had abandoned his noble lineage and his title and become an anarcho-communist. And his works would eventually become the most famous and enduring works of theory in the anarchist movement. He was one of the most influential thinkers of anarchism of all time. Like to this day, he's still considered like the father of anarchism.
Interesting. I wouldn't have thought that someone like what I don't even know where I was going with that. Sorry. Ignore my dumbass.
Was it something about his lineage? Or
Well, I was think it didn't feel like he was super involved, but I was thinking of someone else is where I was going.
yeah, he was. It's really weird. He had like two different phases of his life in as far as like his anarchist ideas go. For part of his life, he was more of like a pacifist. He believed in like nonviolent revolution. And then in other parts of his life, like he was fighting cops in the streets and stuff like that. So it was he but his primary focus was on like what anarchism would look like in the aftermath of revolution and how anarchists were going to prepare for it and build up to it in the event when the time came that revolution happened. On her return from London, she was to speak to a meeting hosted by the Knights of Labor, where she would be discussing the state of the labor movement in Europe and like comparing and contrasting it with unions and labor in the United States. But before the meeting could take place, the chief of police declared that the assembly was unlawful.
As they tend to do when something that they don't like happens.
As they keep doing, this is every time she tries to speak, the police just come and stop her from speaking. They attempted to prevent the attendees from entering the meeting hall, but when they started to argue with the police and try to force their way into the building, uh, the police started cracking skulls and forcing them out, and 50 of the attendees were arrested in the process.
That does not surprise me one bit.
The trial for those arrested anarchists began on January 5th, 1889. Lucy and the defendants argued, ironically, that the police acted unconstitutionally by preventing them from using a space that they had rented. And because they they argued that by renting they were temporarily owners of the building, and so therefore the police preventing them from using it violated their property rights.
Which by modern standards is fairly true, right? As far as I know.
Yeah, by the logic of American law at the time and still today, that is 100% valid. That is absolutely true. They also argued on a free speech basis that it was a violation of their right to free speech.
I mean, it probably is.
Yeah, that is also true. The Chicago Tribune, our old friends, they wrote, quote, "It is wildly ludicrous of Mrs. Parsons and the Red Gang that hangs on her skirts to say it is unconstitutional to stop free speech when its admitted aim is the abolition of all law, all government, and all rights."
So what they're arguing is, I don't know if this exception had been carved out at the time, but um, they're arguing it's falls under the immediate danger clause or whatever. I can't remember the exact terminology, but um,
Uh, no, they're arguing that they're arguing that because these people are advocating for the abolition of law, that they don't have a right to protections by the law.
oh, that's dumb.
Yeah. Yeah, they're saying that, well, if you don't want property to exist and you don't believe in property rights, then why would we respect your property rights?
Because that's the system here now. I have to work with it until I can abolish it. That's
Right. Right. Yeah, we don't want to be like they didn't want to be in that courtroom. They didn't want to be arrested and taken to trial. It was something that was foisted onto them, and so while they're in it, they're going to use the logic of that court to protect themselves. You put them in that situation. That was not them doing it's not hypocritical of them because they didn't do it voluntarily, which is again, it is exactly their point. It's not voluntary. It is something that's inherently forced onto people, which is why they want to get rid of it. So they keep just proving these people right. In trying to stop them, they keep proving them right. It's ludicrous. It's funny.
it sounds like every struggle for rights in America ever.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like yeah, every social movement that's ever existed in the United States that's come under like state repression has been presented with the opportunity to use the government's own government and the law and the court's own logic against them. It was basically the entire platform of the Black Panthers. Like that was their big thing was everything that they were doing was 100% legal and the police were still cracking down on them anyways. That
I mean, like, you know how often that happens in the U.S. Hey, what I'm doing is legal. Well, I don't give a shit.
yeah. Yeah, and for social movements like the anarchist labor movement and with the Black Panthers and with so many others, it works because it builds sympathy. It People are seeing this happen in real time, like people uninvolved, and they're realizing, oh, there are very clearly good guys and bad guys in this situation.
It's kind of funny to watch them do stuff like this because all they're doing is, in my eyes, obviously, is they're just proving the people they're opposing right.
Yeah, yeah. The best way to kill a movement like this is to ignore it because just by feeding into by doing and feeding into the exact thing that they're arguing is happening, by making like their worst like uh their smoke and doom predictions a reality, you're only bolstering their position. That anyways, so luckily for these anarchists, this judge seemed to be a bit more honest than other judges that we've run into so far. He ruled, quote, "The anarchists have the same rights as other citizens to assemble peaceably for the discussion of their views. The police have no right to presume an intention on their part to break laws. Their meetings must not be prohibited or interfered with until a breach of law is actually committed."
Exactly. That's how you should treat it.
Yeah, that's how it works. Uh, at around the same time, a trial was underway for bear with me for a second. A trial was underway for a woman who had shot her husband. Her husband was a Chicago cop.
Oh,
He didn't die. He was just injured by the shot, but she had tried to kill.
I assumed you would have said murdered if she had killed him.
Yeah, so he was still alive. Um, During this trial, the books of police records in the Chicago PD all became public.
Ooh, they dirty laundry gonna get aired.
Yep. And the editors of the Arbeiter Zeitung got their hands on it. It's so funny. The reason that they got their hands on it is because the lawyer team that was um, defending the woman who had shot the cop, was also the same lawyers who defended a lot of anarchists, including they were like the retainers for the Arbeiter Zeitung.
Ah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and so when they got their hands on it, they kind of, which is probably it, I don't know if this was illegal or not, but they kind of just like passed it along to the editors of the Arbeiter Zeitung.
I mean, I guess it depends on what the judge would have like said. Okay, this is what you can use it in. If there wasn't an explicit rule in place or if there wasn't a um, standing law, probably not illegal.
Yeah. And also another newspaper with which was more, it wasn't a socialist newspaper, it was more mainstream, the Chicago Times, also got their hands on it. So I guess it just came out, it just became public during the court case.
Well, that and there's so many ways it could possibly leak that theoretically you can go, well, I didn't do it, I didn't do it, and just pass the buck continuously.
Yeah, so the Arbeiterzeitung published their findings in the records, and two big things came out. The first one was that they found proof that the state's eyewitnesses in several cases against anarchists, including the Haymarket trial, were contradictory to the testimony they gave when they were first presented to police investigators. So what they said in court was different from what they said to the police. The second thing that they discovered was proof that several cops, including the chief of police himself, had been taking bribes from brothels and gambling houses all over the city in order for those places to keep from being shut down.
I mean, a city that's already doing union busting, they're already doing all this corrupt shit. Does it surprise me they were taking bribes?
Yeah, there's this other funny story, or funny part of it that I thought about putting in. The chief of police himself was, at some point, there was a brothel in Chicago somewhere, that actually named, like, appointed him the brothel's private security guard, and like gave him a job with a salary. And as part of that job, he wore a little sheriff's star on his shirt.
That's just asking to get in trouble, to be honest.
Yeah. And every once in a while, when he was appearing in public, he would have that star on his police uniform, and nobody knew what it was because police chiefs in big cities didn't wear stars, and so nobody knew what it was. And then it came out, and people put two and two together and figured out, oh, this denoted that he was defending a brothel. um, yeah, so yeah, these discoveries were published both in the Arbeiterzeitung and in the larger mainstream paper, the Chicago Times. And when the articles came out, the police chief had the editors at both papers arrested for libel.
Of course, he abused his power even more as soon as he found out he was getting caught. Of course.
Yeah. Public opinion in Chicago turned sharply against the police almost overnight. Citizens were calling for a complete overhaul of the police department. Even from like the richest people in Chicago, even all the people who hated anarchists were like, "Oh, these police we need to get rid of these people." The the upcry was so loud that even the governor of Illinois was forced to make a statement, and he denounced the Chicago police as quote unquote despots. That's the actual word he used. He called the Chicago police despots.
I've never been a fan of that word.
Why is that?
It's just a stupid word. I'm not like,
Oh, just like the form of the word itself, not the like the meaning behind it.
no. It just seems like a dumb word, you know?
Yeah, it's really uncomfortable to say, like in your mouth.
What does it even mean? Like, I have like a general idea, but
Basically, basically like a tyrant,
okay.
like like a person with authority abusing their power, that like a dictator or something like that.
Okay. That makes sense.
Ultimately, the city government ended up purging the leadership of the government, firing several of its officers, including the chief, and also the guy who was shot by his wife. Um, he was also fired. I forgot to look up how that court case went. I don't know if his wife got away with it or not. But Lucy, whose constant denunciations of the police made her their primary target for harassment, she ended up gaining a reputation as a crusader for freedom of speech, like just throughout the city. Even people who hated her were kind of like, yeah, yeah, she has a point with the freedom of speech stuff. So, for the time being, the unions of Chicago were free from police harassment because the police had been gutted. and public opinion was they wouldn't be able to spin an attack on unions anymore because nobody in Chicago would believe them.
I mean, after you've been discredited so much, you can't really say shit anymore, you know?
That wouldn't last long.
It usually never does because people's rage doesn't ever last long enough to make change fast enough.
So with this new development, the movement began to look inward. So they got a little breathing room, and I I kind of hate that this is happening at this point because they had an amazing, like a little stretch of time where the police wouldn't dare mess with any unions, and the anarchists and the radicals had an amazing opportunity to do way more stuff. But while that it was happening, uh, they were starting to have like internal divisions. So the argument that had split the Socialistic Labor Party back like a decade before this, it was coming back to the forefront. On one side was Lucy and the quote unquote anarchists who they were anarchists, but like this whole thing was like it was framed as like a fight between anarchists and socialists. So I'll explain. The anarchists rejected electoralism. They advocated for revolution by all means. And on the other side was the newly revived Chicago Socialist Labor Party and their leader, that guy I mentioned, Thomas Morgan. And he advocated for running socialist candidates in elections. And he was so he was trying to discredit anarchists and distance the SLP from like criminality by trying to monopolize the term socialist. And he started pushing the idea that anarchists weren't really socialists, but were actually enemies of socialism.
Don't you love when similar people, like people who have similar goals at least, try and fight amongst each other and cause no progress to be made?
Yeah. Yeah. So both Lucy and this guy, Thomas Morgan, they were both members of the Knights of Labor. And so they were still both attending meeting, like the meetings of the Knights of Labor. And at these meetings, Lucy and Thomas would get into these loud, passionate arguments in front of the entire assembly. Morgan would denounce the Haymarket martyrs and their quote unquote doctrines of physical force, as he put it. He didn't support like direct action. He uh, didn't support like really he didn't like support protests. Honestly, he didn't like the idea of protesting all that much. But he
How the hell do you make change then? Like, just riot? What?
by lobbying and voting. That was his idea. Yeah, yeah, and so he didn't like all of these violent anarchists and all of their dynamite and stuff. And Lucy would shoot back with defenses of her husband and the futility of the ballot box in the face of state repression. At one meeting in late January 1889, Lucy interrupted Morgan in the middle of a speech he was giving, in which he said that he would shut down the Arbeiterzeitung if he could.
That's just that just makes me lose brain cells. To be honest, it sounds like he's working against himself so hard.
Yeah, he's a cop.
Oh, was I think? Oh, I thought you were still talking about that one guy. I thought.
No, 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 no. He's not actually a cop. It's just that's the a lefty joke that um, somebody who's saying who's giving an idea that would hurt the movement, you call them a cop because you're implying that they're an undercover cop trying to undermine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I forgot you wouldn't get that. It's a very lefty sort of joke.
I mean, I learn more lefty shit from you than I ever do on the internet just because I follow dumb shit on the internet. I don't follow serious, real world stuff.
Which is probably help why you're probably just a little bit healthier than I am. Like, but yeah. So Morgan, uh, he said at a meeting at the Knights of Labor that if he could, he would shut down the Arbeiterzeitung. And Lucy just came up and interrupted him and started talking over him.
When you said that, I wanted you to have said she came up and smacked the shit out of him and kicked him out of the meeting. I wanted that.
That's what's really weird about her is that as much as she advocated violence, she never really did all that much violence herself.
That's crazy.
Well, because like in a sense it's like practical because when you start using violence, you start it's and if the situation's right, you start to lose credibility if you start using violence. And in situations like this, she's such a good speaker that as long as she has the ability to be heard, she can always win doing that.
She's better off being a figurehead than she is like an actual in the trenches leader, I guess is one way to put it.
Right. It's this amazing like converging point of her personality and her abilities with her beliefs. She believes very much in the idea of a mass movement of masses of people joining together for a common cause and seeing that cause out to the end and resisting the forces that try and that would be able to crush an individual person. And she's able, her big skill is able being able to rile up masses of people. And that's the strength that she always utilizes, because if you're like individually, like if you're one person and you go to bomb a police station as an example, you are just one person who has bombed one police station. But if you can talk to a crowd of thousands of people,
And get thousands to do some kind of action, you've done way more.
right? Yeah, that's exactly what it is that she's always trying to do. She is a director and a guider of a force that is larger than any individual person. That is her great strength. So, yeah, she stands up, she interrupts him, starts talking over him. He orders her to return to her seat, but she just continued to speak to the assembly, and at one point, she calls Morgan a tyrant. And when he hears that, he gets mad and he orders two of his supporters, just these two big, tough guys, and they grab her by the arms and they drag her from the hall by force.
If you can't win using orator or whatever it's called to being a
Oratory.
oratory skills, however it's pronounced, then you just remove them by force.
Yeah. Yeah, that's Morgan is really a one-trick pony. He's not a good leader. He he's good at passing resolutions, and he's good at writing, and he's good at political campaigning, but he's not inspiring.
I would have never guessed.
And so when faced with a competition of,
Someone who's leagues ahead of him.
yeah, um he the only real option he has, like if he's in a competition of speaking, he's going to lose. And so the only option to him is to stop the other person from speaking. And it does not work because he reveals himself to be a complete hypocrite.
No, I would have never guessed.
Yeah, he advocates against violence and force, but he's happy to use violence and force against his fellow radicals in order to shut them down, because his main priority is becoming the leader of the Chicago labor movement.
Again, it does not surprise me, to be 100% honest. Like, people who like that are like, no, you're threatening my power. Get out of here.
Yeah, and so because of a mixture of Lucy's legendary public speaking skills and Morgan's hypocrisy in threatening force against anarchists while also denouncing them for using force, that caused the debate within the movement to turn in Lucy's favor. On top of that, his whole platform of electing socialists was threatened by the fact that the German community of Chicago, the largest block of socialists in the city by far, were firmly on Lucy's side and would absolutely refuse to vote for SLP candidates. There was really no route to overall to that he had to overall leadership of the Chicago labor movement.
I bet you that ground his gears.
Yeah, and it was all because of the tactics that he had hitched himself to. Lucy was, for all intents and purposes, the dominating figure in the Chicago working class over the years of 1889 through 1891. On October 3rd, 1889, Lucy's 8-year old daughter Lulu died of lymphadenoma, which is it's like a cancer of the lymph nodes. Yeah,
Okay, I assumed it had something to do with the lymph nodes. I had no idea beyond that.
yeah. She had she had been she had survived a case of scarlet fever back in 1886.
That sucks to survive scarlet fever and then die from cancer.
Yeah, well, the it's speculated that the scarlet fever caused it, and it was just dormant and reemerged as a lymph node disease. We don't have much information on Lucy's reaction to this because this from it from the time of from about the time of the Haymarket executions. From that point forward, she was such a public figure that she really started. Um, she just refused to talk about her personal life. Uh, yeah, she just never talked about it in public.
So does this mean she ended her habit of using her son as an example, or did
No, she still did that.
that's hypocritical? That's hypocritical.
Yeah, it. I agree with you. Yeah, it's hypocritical. It's like I fully 100% support her not talking about her personal life, even though it's so frustrating for me and to historians because we know so little about what her thoughts were on events that were happening within her own life. But at the same time, she was forcing her children into the spotlight.
When they really shouldn't have been.
Right. It would be bad enough to be forcing them into the spotlight, but they're specifically forcing them into the spotlight to highlight the trauma that they suffered by their father being executed by the state.
So what she's doing is she's stabbing them, then ripping open an old wound.
Well, somebody else stabbed him, and she's just kind of like, she keeps prodding it open every once in a while. So basically, yeah.
I feel like throwing him out the spotlight is another wound.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's it's so frustrating because I it's one of those things. It's there's a term in anarchism that people like to use, a phrase in anarchism people like to use. It's kill your heroes.
I'm assuming it's because they don't live up to the standards that you have placed upon them.
Yeah, it's uh people can disappoint you, but ideals can't. So fight for the ideals, not for the people. Which
I mean, it makes total sense. Like time and time again, like people rely on athletes as to be their heroes, and like if you want a role model for like athletic skill, yeah, follow athletes that way. If you see half the shit they pull actually like in their real lives, no, do not emulate that.
yeah, and the weird thing is that's exactly what Lucy was trying to live up to by refusing to talk about her personal life. She was trying to prevent herself. She wanted to lead the Chicago labor movement to effectively fight for their own rights and their own protection and to fight towards revolution, but she didn't want to be the one. She didn't want people fighting for her specifically. She didn't want to be a hero.
That makes sense.
And so that's what she was trying to do. And it's a complicated contradictions in her life and her personality and the way that she lived.
I mean, to be fair, when is anything straightforward like that where it's not a contradiction?
Yeah, and in complete honesty, she's probably rolling in her grave knowing that there are people who talk about her as a person and are curious about her life and like what she was like personally. She probably, if she was in the room with me right now, she would be smacking me upside the head because she did not want people talking about her. She wanted people to be talking about the things she said, the ideas that she was presenting.
We're doing both.
Yeah, and that's, yeah, I want to, respect her memory by allowing her ideas to be released unfiltered and allowing people who hear it to make up their minds on what they think about her. But then also at the same time, I want to explore who she was as a person and how that interacted with her beliefs. But yeah, anyways, um, in July of 1891, one of the weirder events in her life happened. She took a man to court.
Ooh, explain.
It all started when another anarchist named Martin Latcher moved into Lucy's apartment a couple years prior. For unclear reasons, he moved out at some point in 1891. And one day he came to her apartment, kicked in the door, and destroyed several pieces of furniture with an axe. Those are the only details in the case that have ever been settled as for sure having actually happened. Lucy came into court with a black eye. On the stand, she claimed that she had let him stay with her because he was unemployed and needed to get back on his feet. He and that she had kicked him out because he was abusing her. He was physically and emotionally abusive towards her.
Um, quick aside: was he abusing her, or like was the how true is her statement?
I'll get through all of this real quick, and then I'll give my idea on what's actually going on here because this is kind of complicated, and I don't want to start muddling it up by starting to speculate too soon.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah. And she said that the reason that she had allowed him to stay at her house for so long, or her apartment, was because he had threatened to publicly accuse her of being an adulterer because she was living with a man out of wedlock, which would have ruined her credibility in 19th century American society. She also claimed that he was upset at being kicked out, so he came to the apartment to threaten her and to destroy her furniture under the pretense that she had taken it from him. And in the process of doing that, she had struck her, which would explain her black eye. Martin came into court with a bandaged gash on his arm. He claims that he had moved in because they were dating.
Oh, completely different story.
Yeah. And that he was deeply in love with her. He said that she had kicked him out because 2 weeks prior to the incident, she had hosted a party at the apartment and invited another person that Martin didn't like, which caused them to fight. He came back a couple weeks later and demanded that she return his furniture to him, which she refused to do. So he entered the home by force and destroyed his own furniture in order to ensure and just to get back at her basically because he claimed he was like emotionally distraught that the woman he loved was now scorning him. And in the process of destroying the furniture, she struck him with a clothing iron, cutting his arm. So, because it's been pretty well ascertained by the little bit of scholarship that's actually been done on her, it's pretty well been ascertained that she had that during the over the course of her life following Albert's death, she had several relationships with different men.
As to be expected.
Right? Yeah, it's a normal thing. But because she was black and be or that's some more complicated stuff. She never claimed she she vehemently denied that she was black for her entire life. but she was black. But because she wasn't white, and because she was um, or because she wasn't white, she wasn't legally allowed to marry the vast majority of the men in Chicago who were all white. But being in these relationships would have caused her to lose credibility in the public eye, because a woman living with a man and having relationships with men out of marriage was, of course, a big no no, and in a lot of cases was actually criminal.
A bunch of other BS stuff, basically.
Yeah. And so I say with a fair amount of confidence that she was probably in a relationship with this guy.
Okay.
And what I think happened was that this was just an ugly breakup, but because of her position in the public eye, she didn't want to risk the she realized that she was the face of Chicago labor and of Chicago anarchism, and she feared that if it became public that she was an adulterer and that she was sleeping with men out of wedlock and even living with them out of wedlock, that that it would ruin her reputation and by extension destroy the and hurt the reputation of the movement that she was a part of. And so what I think happened was that she threw him to the wolves in order to protect the integrity of
The movement.
the Chicago the yeah, the movement.
That sounds about right.
That is my theory. And I think that that's very much in line with her personality. She was always very willing to put the good of the movement ahead of her own personal relationships. But regardless of what the truth was, the Chicago papers absolutely savaged Lucy. The entire narrative was centered around Lucy breaking the sacred covenant of marriage by living with a man outside of wedlock, and she caused the entire situation in the first place by, being a whore, in their words.
Plenty of people lived out of wedlock. They can go get fucked for I care.
There has never been a moment in human history where people weren't fucking that weren't married. That is just that is a constant of human history. That is not something you are ever going to stop from happening. And people who think they can stop it from happening are deluded and have no connection to reality.
Agreed. Like it's dumb to think you can stop people from fucking. Humans are horny. They're gonna fuck.
So the judge shared the sentiment with the press. And even though neither the defense nor the prosecution disputed the fact that he had threatened Lucy and destroyed the furniture, which is what he was on trial for, the judge dismissed the charge of malicious mischief and instead fined him $25 for disorderly conduct.
Ah, fuck the judge.
Fuck the judge, yeah. I have no idea what to do with this story. I don't know how to interpret it in the context of like Lucy's life beyond like my own theory on it. But I
It sounds like she was trying to find someone. It wasn't working out, and there was a spat. Whoever was in the wrong was in the wrong, and it kind of got dragged into court. And she was trying to save face as much as she could.
I will say two things though. One, it was a bit hypocritical of Lucy to take this situation to court. And two, the judge and the media were super fucking sexist.
No, I would have never guessed.
So that's a bad thing that happened to Lucy. How do you feel about them?
Here's the sips.
The yips. Oh yeah, here's the worst part about the whole situation. After the trial, that guy Martin Latcher, he moved back in with his wife and three daughters.
Oh, that douchebag. That that pig. I don't care who was in the wrong with that. On he was in the wrong in more, in my opinion, because he had a wife and kids.
Yeah, I've heard a bunch of stories. Um, I've heard a bunch of stories of like back during this time, the father of a family would just up and move like across the country, like into the wilderness, and just leave the family. But I guess that still happens today. Just up and leave and just never see the family again.
I don't I don't understand how people can do that. By the way, like
I don't understand it either, but I can understand this even less because he moved into Lucy's this other woman's house for 2 years. 2 years while his family, who still knew him and saw him every day, lived 2 blocks away.
2 blocks away.
2 blocks.
Okay, he lost penis privileges.
He lost his penis privileges.
I am very much like, hey, do what you want, but like legally separate or something. Fuck.
Well, you couldn't legally separate back then. That wasn't a thing.
What? I forgot that.
Yeah, I mean, divorce wasn't a thing unless it was under like very specific circumstances. Yeah, once you legally married, you were legally married. There was no getting out of that except for death.
And that's why people killed their spouses.
That is why people killed their spouses. By 1892, socialism was becoming a very, very prominent force in American politics, especially in the labor movement. The American Federation of Labor, the AFL, was founded in 1896. And oh, I'm sorry, that's wrong. In 1886. I typed that in wrong. God. Anyways, at the AFL convention in 1890, a resolution was proposed which called for the collective ownership of the means of production by the American people. It was narrowly defeated by a handful of votes. Now, have you heard of the AFL? Do you know of the AFL?
Run it by me and I'll see if I remember.
Today, the AFL is the largest labor union in the United States. It's the largest like umbrella organization labor union in the United States.
My dad always told me labor unions were important, but he didn't really go into like big important ones or whatever.
But yeah, so the AFL is one of the most important, or probably the single most important labor organization that has ever existed in American history. And just 4 years after their founding, they were presenting proposals which got half of the organization supported it, calling for the collective ownership of the means of production. That's how they got started.
Have they lost their way today?
They lost their way almost immediately, yeah.
That sounds about right.
What's weird is that um that resolution that was proposed in 1890, it failed, but then it was represented 3 years later in 1893 and it passed. But then the same year the AFL made an agreement with the federal government to not organize black workers. And almost immediately after passing this resolution, it took a really conservative stance away from socialism.
So they, like you said, they stumbled immediately.
Yeah. And over the years it kind of became like it became very heavily associated with the Democratic Party. And during the early 20th century, it was hugely it was like one of the primary forces in like the Red Scares. Like it was very deeply anti-communist.
That doesn't surprise me one bit.
Yeah. And a big part of that was because of their connections to the mob, which the mob were very there's a whole thing I could go into about the mob and its connections to government anti-communist work.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure. It's
Yeah, so it's yeah, It started out like very radical, um, but its leadership turned it away from the socialist movement, associated it with one of the two prominent parties, got super mobbed up, and then got stabbed in the back by that same party when Clinton came to office.
Again, makes total sense. Tracks.
Yeah, with the rise of socialism came the rise of labor militancy and an equally militant response from employers. In 1892, a strike at a silver mine in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, was violently suppressed when the federal government declared it a rebellion and sent 1,000 federal troops to suppress the strike. The troops arrested hundreds of miners and confined them to what were nicknamed bullpens, which were basically little concentration camps.
Tracks. Tracks.
The same year, two industrialists named Henry Clay Frick and another guy you've probably heard of named Andrew Carnegie.
Nope.
You haven't heard of Andrew Carnegie?
Nope.
Have you heard the term robber barons?
I've heard of that, yeah.
Yeah, he was the arch robber baron. He was like the god of robber barons.
Okay.
Yeah, so Frick and Carnegie decided that they were going to break apart the union at one of their steel mills in Homestead, Pennsylvania. And they had a lockout. They locked out the union workers from the mill. The Union Steel Workers occupied the mill, and in response, the Carnegie Steel Company sent barges full of Pinkertons up the Monongahela, God, this river's name, Monongahela River to force them out. Do you know who?
Um, as a kid, I thought the Pinkertons were cool as fuck. As an adult, I realized the Pinkertons were pieces of shit.
Yeah. Wait, you knew about the Pinkertons as kids? As a kid?
You're talking to someone who is obsessed with mystery solving, Derek.
Okay, yeah, yeah, that's true. Yeah, I wasn't thinking about that.
Like, they talked about how they would, like, the Pinkertons were really famous investigators. They didn't go into detail, but, like, I was like, oh my god, these are the badass Old West detectives, is how I thought of it as a kid, not understanding how time works.
That's the romanticized version. Is one they were like private detectives in the old west, and two they were the temporary bodyguards, like they were the Secret Service for President Lincoln before the Secret Service existed.
Yeah, well, that's not what it ended up being.
Yeah, and then you dig into their history, and like the majority of what they were doing was
Scummy bullshit.
yeah, killing striking workers because they, you know, only wanted to work 8 hours a day. Those fucking greedy bastards. Yeah. So as their barges approached the steel mill, the Union workers opened fire on the Pinkertons with rifles and pistols. The Pinkertons tried to land, got out of their boats, and were just getting gunned down just by in swaths. And the Pinkertons were eventually forced to flee. That's an example of some industrialists losing, of some strikebreakers losing.
You gonna get me drunk, Derek. You gonna get me drunk.
Prost.
Cheers.
The union at the homes at Homestead was eventually suppressed by state militias, but the Battle of Homestead was the first real event which could be considered a battle between unions and strikebreakers in American history. And Lucy was really excited about it. Yeah, like Lucy, she was 100% convinced with every one of these things happening. The revolution is any day now. It is right around the corner. The American workers cannot take any more of this. It has to be just sometime soon.
Imagine how much she'd keel over in her grave knowing it hasn't happened.
Oh, she lives she lives to a pretty ripe old age and gets disillusioned eventually, but we'll get to that. Um, Also, by 1892, a new generation of American anarchists were starting to make a name for themselves. This new stock of radicals largely came from the fresh waves of immigrants coming to the US from Europe, especially Jewish refugees fleeing pogroms in Russia. So in Russia at the time, there was this prominent radical movement that was going on called the Nihilists, that had just recently assassinated a czar, um, and they weren't really like revolutionaries. They were just kind of like, think like edgy teens, but like they're throwing bombs at kings and emperors. That's basically what they are.
Basically, everyone on social media who touts the IRA, even though they have no idea what the IRA is about.
I wouldn't even do more like think emo or goth, but with less black.
So even less educated than that, the those.
Yeah. The thing is, they were usually very well educated. They usually had like a grounding in philosophy and some sort of that in their background of education. They were just like they would appear in public wearing like these really gaudy, strange, like very not conservative clothing. They would they rejected working. They just spend all their days writing poems and going to like social events. Um, they A lot of them were itinerant. They just wander from town to town, and they also wanted to just shake things up in the social order and start throwing bombs at uh, czars. That was their big thing. But it's out of the nihilist movement that the later radical movements in Russia became prominent, especially anarchism and another like very specific to Russia sort of ideology called Narodism, or Narodniki in Russian. Um,
Can you give me the bare bones on that one?
yeah, they basically believed in the overthrow of the czarist government and the formation of a socialist economy and a socialist system based on councils of peasants. So they believed that the peasants were the heart of the Russian nation and the Russian culture and economy, and so they advocated for the overthrow of the existing system and the a collectivized economy based on democratic assemblies of like peasants' councils.
Okay.
Very very specific to Russia, because Russia was really the only place left in like the European area that still had that was still like majority peasants. So and the Narodniks later on became they formed a party called the Socialist Revolutionary Party, and they were a good portion of the socialist revolutionaries ended up becoming allied with the Bolsheviks during the revolutions of 1917. But yeah, but we're tough that this is about the anarchists. So
Back to topic.
yeah, so two of the most prominent of these Jewish refugees becoming radicals. Uh, they were a pair of lovers who had immigrated to the United States as teens, and in 1892 they were living in Worcester, Massachusetts. They had started to call themselves anarchists after the Haymarket trial. Their names were Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman. I wanted to pause real quick to see if you'd heard that name. I can't tell like what names you've heard or not.
I just assume I've never heard of a name unless it's like in a history book, like in like a like high school or like generic bare bones history book.
Yeah, but like I wanted to see if you'd heard the name Emma Goldman before, because she does appear in like discussing like feminism and things, like the history of feminism and the suffrage movement and things like that.
I mean, it doesn't ring any bells, but it we've kind of been over this. History wasn't really my subject. I mean, I it's not the subject that I tuned out, but like it wasn't the one where I was into every little detail, you know?
Yeah, so Berkman and Goldman weren't particularly involved in unions with the labor movement like the earlier anarchists. They were more bohemian. Their radicalism came more from radical book clubs and like intellectual discussions. They're more like academic brained than they were like on the ground on the picket lines and in the union halls. But don't let that fool you. They were every bit as radical as the Chicago anarchists, and they proved it in a very big way. Have you ever heard the term propaganda by the deed?
No.
Propaganda by the deed is a concept in political theory of spreading radical ideas to the masses by using enormous displays of violence or disobedience that they perpetrate against that are perpetrated largely by like individual people. The intent was to target large figures in the ruling class, usually with bombings or assassinations, in order to inspire revolutionary fervor in the lower classes. So like that's what the nihilists were doing when they assassinated the czar in Russia. They were trying to propagandize to the people that these people aren't these people aren't untouchable. They die just like you and me, and you can fight back against them. Is that kind of thing.
Okay.
On July 23rd, 1892, Alexander Berkman walked into the office of Henry Clay Frick, that guy we talking about. And I think this was just right after the Homestead strike ended. He walked to the office of Frick in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, pulled out a pistol and a dagger. He shot Frick twice and stabbed him 3 times. Frick Frick ended up surviving, shockingly. Okay, this is a confusing part of this assassination attempt that I haven't been able to quite parse out, but every source that I saw said that uh, Berkman was aiming at Frick's head when he pulled the trigger, but he wasn't only he didn't just survive it, but he was still conscious to call for the police.
Okay.
So I don't know if he was actually shot in the head.
Maybe he got grazed?
Maybe. I'm not exactly sure, but Frick survived and Berkman was arrested. The press the press linked the assassination attempt to the Haymarket bombing.
Why in the fuck would they do that?
Yeah, they didn't it wasn't like a literal connection, like it was like a conspiracy and it was connected in some way. It was just like look, just like these anarchists, they were throwing bombs at cops in Chicago, and now they're
Oh, they're like the anarchists are at a again kind of thing.
yes, yeah, exactly. And so as a result of that, an anti-radical hysteria swept through the nation. Lucy, for her part, she praised Berkman. She called him a hero and she started organizing public meetings to defend him. I bring that up because Emma Goldman is going to become a pretty prominent part of the story, and also because propaganda of the deed is going to be, it was a big deal in anarchism at the time.
Okay.
In 1893, just the following year, another recession hit the country. It's just so, we've already had 3 recessions in less than 20 years.
I mean, just look at our future.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. The American economy isn't what it used to be.
I expect it to get much worse.
It's going to get much worse. So 1893, there's another recession. 4 million people are now across the country are now unemployed. Once again, Chicago socialism was experiencing an influx of working class support. A progressive judge named John Altgeld, who was a German immigrant, had been elected as the governor of Illinois. And in 1893, public pressure motivated him to pardon and release the 3 living Haymarket defendants who were still in prison.
Not gonna lie, I forgot there were still living Haymarket people.
Yeah, yeah, it was the Haymarket Eight. Five, four died by hanging, one died by suicide, 3 more were still in prison. So, so yeah, that caused a big stir. Um, People across the country were calling Altgeld a bloodthirsty anarchist and calling for his head.
I can understand why he pardoned them. They should have been pardoned in the first place. And knowing America's propaganda machine, I understand why people were calling him an anarchist, just an anarchist sympathizer because Americans nothing but it's propaganda.
Yeah, there were lots of papers that were saying like panicking and saying like Like the anarchists have infiltrated a state government. Next is going to be the federal government. They're going to take over the country and destroy private property and family values, and lead the country into chaos, and murder is going to be legal and all this kind of stuff.
If my eyes could physically roll, they'd be rolling faster than a slot machine.
Oh yeah. 1894 turned out to be a pretty eventful year across the country. Arguably, that year was the closest the United States ever came to a working class revolution, besides maybe the Great Depression. And that was all thanks to one of my favorite historical figures from American history, probably my second favorite behind John Brown. So that spring, the American Railway Union went on strike at the Pullman Palace Car Company just outside of Chicago. And it was led by the union's founder, a longtime rail worker. Like he started working on rail lines when he was like 14, like 11 actually. So his entire life has just been rail work.
I've been working on the railroad.
All the live long day. So this man's name was Eugene Victor Debs. I love Eugene Debs. His life was fantastic and phenomenal. And like I don't know if I'm going to talk about him more in the next episode, but he would later go on to be arrested for he was arrested for protesting against the First World War. And while he was in prison, he ran for president and got 5% of the vote.
What?
Yeah.
5% of the vote back then?
Yeah. While he was in prison.
Oh.
In another one of his, he ran for president like 6 times. I think the most he got was like 9%.
That's unheard of.
Yeah. He was running on like the Socialist Party ticket. And just also, his trial when he was arrested for protesting against the First World War and American involvement in the First World War, he obviously used a free speech defense, and the prosecution argued that um, free speech did not extend to speech which had the potential to cause harm to people.
Yeah, it's the clear and present danger clause. Like, you're not allowed to shout fire in a crowded room. You're not allowed to all that stuff.
I was just about to say it was the prosecution at that trial against Eugene Debs where the term shouting fire in a crowded theater was coined, because that's the exact phrase that the prosecution used against Eugene Debs. That's where it comes from.
And I know all about these exceptions because I went to school for them.
Yeah. In this particular case, it's crazy because this was one of the like foundational cases that set the precedent for the clear and present danger exception. It was complete bullshit because the clear and present danger he was talking about was the threat of American people not being into getting involved in the First World War. So, anyways, this isn't an episode about Eugene Debs, who I'd love to do an episode, or love to do a series or an episode about. But so the company that owned the Pullman Palace Car Company, this guy named George Pullman was operating the Pullman operation out of a company town that he had built to his own specifications. And I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I have to talk about this. George Pullman was bug fuck insane.
Are we talking Alexander Sane or how?
Actually, actually, not super far off using that comparison. George Pullman was a huge megalomaniac. His entire life and his business career was devoted to like this ideology um of like building the perfect society in his vision. And his idea of a perfect society was uh one where working class where ruling class like capitalists and industrialists just completely ruled the world with an iron fist, and working class people lived in like these nice, pretty, kept up communities, but were super isolated and alienated, and were completely reliant on their employer to be able to live.
So basically, it's corporate towns or whatever.
Yeah, it was a company town. But most company towns, they're not ideologically driven. They're just like, we'll keep our we'll keep our employees in line by having a a like an iron grip on the place where they live and the way that they're able the stores that they're able to visit and buy the things they need to live from. Pullman, Illinois, the town that George Pullman founded, was he envisioned it as like a utopian community. So it was built like really nice and really well kept and really clean.
That has no bearing on any utopian society I would want any part of.
Yeah, and there wasn't like a community, there wasn't like a municipal government. There wasn't a like the municipal police force were like like a private police force that was employed by the Pullman Car Company.
It's literally just a corporate town.
Yeah, the way that he set up this town was meant to ensure that his employees were constantly working, that they never drank, never gambled, and never wasted time in church, so that their entire every waking moment of their life was dedicated to providing labor to the Pullman Company.
So basically, if someone had an idealized version of capitalism, they're like, oh, no one gets hurt, but we're always being productive. No one's going to have like unsatisfaction.
Right. And so like the employees that worked there, they would they get paid a certain amount, but before they got their paycheck, their rent and their groceries were deducted from the paycheck. And so what they actually got paid was what was left over after that. And during the recession of 1893, their rents went up and they got pay cuts. And so in some cases, some of the workers were only getting about like they after the rent was deducted and the gross like the cost of living was deducted from the paycheck, they were getting about 3 cents a week.
That's some horseshit.
And so in 1894, Eugene Debs had successfully unionized this town, and they were going on strike during the recession of 1893. Yeah, Pullman had been cutting wages and firing union organizers. They went on strike, and the strike very shockingly quickly spread to every rail line in the like something like 90% of the rail lines in the country were shut down because of strikes. Nothing was getting anywhere. It was the largest shutdown of the US economy pretty much that has ever happened. And and then it was also spreading to other industries, steel, coal, like consumer goods. All these different industries were starting to go on like sympathy strikes, and they were starting to make their own demands, and it was just spreading everywhere. If I remember correctly, something like 30 or 35% of the entire workforce of the United States was walking off of the job at the same time. It was enormous. And it all started in Pullman, Illinois, which was just outside the city limits of Chicago. When I say this is the closest, probably the closest the United States ever got to an actual socialist revolution, I I mean like never at another time in American history has the working class of the United States ever been so single-mindedly unified towards a goal. It it is mind-boggling. And then of course, as part of the strike, they they instituted a nationwide boycott specifically on Pullman train cars. So in a lot of places in the country, they were still letting like rail through, but they were the like rail workers were refusing to hook up Pullman cars specifically to a lot to outgoing engines. They were just Pullman cars were just sitting. And I don't think I explained this. Pullman cars were like luxury cars. So they were train cars.
The bougie car.
Yeah, they were train cars that were really expensive to ride on. They were specifically designed to be smoother, have like a smoother ride that was less rocky, and had a whole bunch of amenities. Like uh, they had like a food car, a smoking car, like sleeping cars with like nice rooms and things like that. It's what how rich people rode on trains. So the boycott the boycott itself was more successful than anybody could have predicted, and the Pullman company was very much at risk of going bankrupt and just losing everything. And because of as an extension of that, the entire rail industry was on the verge of economic collapse, which would have been devastating to the US economy. It would have shut everything down if all of those rail lines started to close. Company strike breakers were completely helpless to stop all of the violence and the riots that were happening everywhere. They kept trying to crack down on these strikes, but as soon as they put it down, it just rised back up again, even stronger than it was before. Because because if they got beat down, they weren't walking back into work because there were so many other parts of this chain of rail lines and of industry that were still out of the workplace. And so they had every feasible backup to just come back and go back on strike. And so the rail industry and George Pullman started uh, to appeal to the federal government. And the president at the time, President Grover Cleveland, agreed to step in. He devised a plan that would make a crackdown of the strikes look legal. And the way he would do that is he planned to hook up postal service USPS mail cars and hook them up to Pullman cars so that when the striking workers refused to hook up Pullman cars, they would be violating federal law by hindering the delivery of the mail. And this ridiculous plan actually ended up working. And federal troops were sent in under the guise of enforcing federal law and allowing the mail to go through.
Sounds like they just wanted to reestablish control, and they're like, we'll do it this way.
Yeah, they found a way to crack down on internal unrest, and they did it in a way that gave them an out for claiming that it was legal. And it worked. And the striking Pullman workers, their union was broken up and they returned to work. And the strikes all over the country ended up falling apart as a result. Eugene Debs was arrested and he spent 6 months in prison. While he was in there, he read a whole bunch of different kinds of books.
Did he read theory or just all kinds of different books?
He read a whole bunch of theory, and he was especially inspired by Karl Marx. And when he was released, he was a full blown socialist.
Lovely.
Lucy had a very deep admiration for Debs. She was deeply moved by his speeches and by his leadership ability, and despite the failures of the Pullman strike, she believed that he had the potential to be the leader that would guide the working class to revolution, which, in all fairness, yes, he absolutely did. If things had gone differently, he would have been the Vladimir Lenin of the United States. He was just that. He was a fantastic public speaker. He was ideologically like ideologically driven. He had an image for the future and he had a way to draw people to this image of the future that he was presenting. And if things had gone differently, he would have been the leader of like a socialist revolution in the United States. So, yeah, that was a Pullman strike. Despite her reputation, Lucy's reputation as a defender of free speech, and despite all of the gatherings and the events that she had organized in the years since the Haymarket executions, she had been unable to speak in public herself under the threat of arrest. So, this entire time that we've been talking about, this whole episode, she's organizing events. She's talking to workers on the ground. She's visiting picket lines. She's selling papers, she's writing, she's doing all the stuff, but the one thing she's not doing is actually giving speeches to huge crowds of people.
So she kind of pulled out from the speeches for a little bit.
Yeah, she had to because the cops were pretty much always kind of in proximity of her at this point. And if it even appeared that she might be starting to talk to a large crowd of like working people, they would have pounced on her and arrested her immediately. She had appealed to the newly elected mayor, guy who had just been elected at the time, who was a little bit more liberal than the last guy had been, and asked him to lift this unofficial ban on her speeches and compel the police to allow her to speak. But he said that he'd taken under consideration, and then he never did anything. So this this sort of harassment campaign continued. At a memorial rally at the graves of the Haymarket martyrs on November 11th, 1896, Lucy was arrested when she attempted to speak before the crowd in front of the grave of her dead husband. The police were attempting to get the crowd to fight back against the arrest. They were trying to arrest her in front of everybody in order to piss them off and get them to attack the police, which would then give them the justification to drive them out. But they ended up not taking the bait, and so the rest of them were allowed to speak. The rally was allowed to continue, and Lucy ended up being released later that same day. Yeah, that's a bad thing that happened.
3 sips.
3 sips. So in this incident where she got arrested at this rally at the martyrs' graves, to give you an idea of how infamous Lucy was at this point, the guy who came up to speak after Lucy was arrested was a guy named Johann Most, who was another German immigrant. Johann Most was infamous across the country because he was the guy who popularized the idea of propaganda of the deed.
Propaganda of the deed.
His name, yeah, it's with what I explained earlier. It's like assassinating and bombing people to propagandize.
Okay. For some reason, my brain wasn't making that connection.
His At this point, his name was synonymous across the country with terrorism. Like at this time, if you heard the word terrorism, you've pictured his face.
For domestic terrorism.
Yeah. The police felt that it was more important to get Lucy out of the way, and they allowed Johann Most to speak.
Interesting. Quick question. Was there a lot of foreign terrorism at the time?
Define foreign terrorism.
Terrorists that are not American.
Well, that's complicated. Depends on how you define American.
Were they residing within the country like long term?
Yes. Yes, they were residing within the country. Like the idea of going to another country to do terrorism over there. I'm sure it happened, but it wasn't.
There wasn't really a distinction yet.
Yeah, there wasn't.
I bet it'd be kind of hard because like a lot of people could, unless you were doing like that you get over here and you immediately do it, or you're doing like a long-term plan, there'd be hard to tell people who are just immigrating and doing terrorism versus people who are coming over just for the terrorism.
Yeah, and it can get kind of blurred too, because like the guys who did 9/11, a lot of them had lived in the United States prior to doing that. So like it
Well, I knew they had. We have like more effective reasons on quote unquote citizenship now, so it's harder to. Uh, it's easier to draw the line. Let me put it that way.
yeah. I guess in their case, because Al Qaeda wasn't based in based in the United States, that's why it was foreign terrorism. So at this time, if terrorism was happening, there were bombings and assassinations and stuff going on, but it was usually like from organizations within their own country.
Okay.
So it was mostly domestic. But it was a lot of these assassinations, like with Berkman, when he tried to kill Frick. Um, a lot of people saw it as like foreign terrorism because he was an immigrant. He was originally from Russia, and so a lot of people consider it to be like a foreigner coming into the country to do violence and try to push like radicalism and that kind of thing.
I can see the argument on both, and I also see how the line. wasn't quite so clear back then as well.
Yeah.
Like nowadays, you can probably quite well kind of draw a line. Back then, it's again, it's not so easy. Like,
Yeah, and a lot of the distinction between foreign and domestic terrorism, a lot of it is just like the way it's portrayed in media or the way it's classified by the government. It's more in a lot of ways it's kind of more ideologically classified than it is like any set standards for like where it originates or who's doing it.
okay,
Yeah, so that same year, 1894, or I'm sorry, 1896, Emma Goldman, lady we were talking about earlier, she returned to the US from a stay in Europe where she had been studying nursing, and she was quickly becoming a loud proponent of the idea of free love.
I've never had someone explain free love. I have like a general concept, but could you?
It it's basically the idea that it's kind of like it's a rejection of marriage. So it's the idea, or really more like a rejection of relationships. So you can have like a relationship with people with a person, but it's not like strictly monogamous. You're allowed
So it's kind of like early polyamory.
kind of, but like modern poly relationships are still like exclusive. So like you're well, yeah, you're right. Yeah, that so what free love basically was, it was basically you just like you would have relationships, but they wouldn't be like formal relationships, and you were still free and open to uh having relationships and sexual or emotional relationships with other people. um it was a rejection of the idea of being tied down with like being tied down emotionally or sexually with other people, with another person. Yeah.
It's kind of like the idea that we're animals, just sleep with whoever you feel like. Don't worry about it
Right. Yeah.
later, but still kind of like respecting the individual instead of just being like, oh, I'm just going to sleep with you and move on kind of thing.
Yeah. It was heavily, especially with Emma Goldman's feminism, it was heavily tied to women's emancipation. So the proponents of free love, both during this time and later, like with the hippies and like the 60s and 70s, the idea of free love was basically like, um, in like feminist terms, was based on the idea that marriage is a form of ownership over women, and so they rejected the formation of those monogamous sorts of relationships in order to.
I can understand that viewpoint on marriage and monogamous relationships because when you're bringing in the government, that's kind of in the long run what it ends up being is the male, whether the breadwinner. Let me put it that way because that's not really always just the male because there are gay relationships and lesbian relationships that don't quite meet that standard. But it's like, okay, one, there's an expectation that one becomes quote unquote subservient to the other, legally at speaking.
Yeah, and if you look at it historically and like sociologically, anthropologically, um, that is where marriage originates from. It was from the idea that women were the property of men, and that marriage was a contract between two men, from a father selling off his daughter to another man to become his wife.
It's crazy to think that our modern concept of marriage and a relationship structure, that marriage being the stereotypical end goal, came from stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah, and they're like, legally speaking, it's come a very long way, but legally speaking, there are sorts of trappings of that still kind of left in the institution of marriage today. But it's
Oh, 100%.
yeah, but it's not nearly it. You'd have to be kind of, it'd be kind of asinine claim that it's still strictly just a business transaction today, the way that it's actually practiced in like modern society. But back then,
I would current marriage is more like other than just the personal commitment, like the ring part, like that. I feel like there's a little bit there that's between you and them. Is like, no, this isn't easy because of the trappings of the government part. It is like it's to show you, yes, I definitely am there for you. But the other part, it's just a thing saying, hey, government, we're tied together. I want tax benefits.
yeah, yeah, and it's and of course with the changing of like social norms, the laws around it change, and the with the laws changing, the social attitudes around it change. It kind of feeds into itself. So we develop to a point now where it's not it's more like a statement of monogamous commitment between two people, more two consenting people, more than it is like the passing of property from one man to another. But back then it still was a lot closer to that than it is to what it is now. And so that's what figures like Emma Goldman were kind of arguing against, and why they were advocating like free love. And so there was a divide that was developing in American anarchism during this time. One strand of anarchism, which was embodied and also largely led by Lucy Parsons, was centered around class struggle and collective liberation of the working class from capitalism, the classic socialist conception of anarchism. And the new strand, of which Goldman was quickly becoming the figurehead, was more intellectual and also individualistic. It was advocating more for personal liberties and the liberation of the individual, and like universal freedom of choice for individual people in their own lives. So the in Goldman's mind, anarchism was about liberating individual people from the social constructs, and both like physical and metaphysical, that kind of constrain people to limit the the ways that they can make choices within their lives. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
So these two women first met at a convention that was held in Chicago in 1897, where Eugene Debs had formed a project that was simply called the Social Democracy. The goal of the Social Democracy, this isn't important, I just thought it was really weird and I put it in there. The goal of the Social Democracy was to coordinate the settlement of the state of Washington by radicals from the East in order to turn the state into a cooperative socialist commonwealth. That was the goal, and it was supported by almost all of the prominent socialists of the time. It's really weird.
I mean, do you know how many things throughout history are weird? Like I've come to accept that like things don't make sense connection wise when looking at it from a modern perspective.
Yeah, I don't know what to think about that. It's kind of a anyways. So yeah, so that wasn't important. But what is important is that Lucy really didn't like the path that anarchism was taking, which was the path that Emma Goldman represented. She didn't much care for the idea of free love, despite the fact that she personally had carried on several extramarital affairs over the years since her husband's death. Though, like I mentioned before, that might have been because she wasn't legally able to marry because because all of her lovers were white and she wasn't, so it wasn't legal. But she publicly and vocally believed in the natural law of the nuclear family unit. She believed that the like one man married to one woman having kids. She believed that that was just a natural formation of humanity, and that the idea of free love was just an absurd waste of time. She publicly and vocally, or she was also frustrated by the trend of the anarchists away from class struggle towards like individual fulfillment and individual liberation. Though she wholeheartedly spoke out against things like racism and sexism, she believed that those issues were consequences of the capitalist system and that they would be dealt a death blow by the overthrow of capitalism. And so like Emma Goldman's brand of feminism didn't appeal to her because she thought it distracted from the labor movement, and she was a syndicalist as much as an anarchist. And so
What is this syndicalist?
it's as I explained last episode, it's socialists who believe that the revolution will be led by labor unions, and that labor unions would form the building blocks of society after the revolution is accomplished.
I totally forgot about that. Not I'm not gonna be uh, not gonna lie about it. So it's basically working within the system. If I'm summarizing it right.
No, it's like it's just using labor unions to overthrow capitalism. Yeah, so it's very much revolutionary, and she was because she was like yeah, just stab, shoot, and blow up the capitalists, but she believed in organizing that effort through labor unions. Whereas Goldman was more like individual people should do individual acts to resist and defy capitalism until capitalism and the state's existence is no longer tenable, and it can no longer continue to exist in the face of individual people living free from it. It's very complicated. It's a lot of theory, but it's important for understanding why Lucy was thinking the way that she was. She began to write articles in various socialist publications where she said that if the anarchist movement continued down the path of free love over class struggle, then she would leave the anarchist movement. And that is a threat that she would eventually carry out. And that's all I have. That's all I have for them. For
You gotta leave on a teaser like that, really?
yeah, yeah. I need a reason. I need to give people a reason to come back for the third episode.
Fair, but still.
Yeah. So what are you thinking? What are you thinking so far?
I feel like this episode wasn't as much about Lucy as it was setting the groundwork for next episode. Really, like this is all the things that happened in the intermediary kind of. Like I know not not in a direct sense, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, that's I didn't intend to do that, but that's how it kind of turned out. Was that there's just a lot of stuff going on that's important to her development going into like this later phase in her life.
Oh no, this is definitely like setting the uh, groundwork, and it's like it's definitely needed because like how do you know how she gets to the next episode? Because like a lot of stuff changes because of this episode. Like again, like the the landscape is changing kind of in this episode.
Yeah, it's this weird moment where she's at like the height of her notoriety and her and like the sway that she has within the labor movement and within radicalism and anarchism, and it's it's happening at the exact same time that these movements that she's become such an intimate part of are starting to go down a path that she is wholeheartedly opposed to. So she's starting to become more friendly with figures like Eugene Debs, who's very much not an anarchist. And she's her first priority is and always will be with sticking with the labor movement and pushing the labor movement toward towards revolution. And what I'm trying to accomplish with this episode is trying to establish the series of events and this era of her life that's going to shift her towards a new direction, because the anarchist movement that she's devoted so much of her life and her time to is moving away from it. Uh, and it's going to be the most important part of the later stages of her life.
Any other comments before we go?
Um, no, nothing from me. Tim, what are your pluggables?
They could find me on Twitter at Tim, aka Otis. Where can they find you?
They can find me on Twitter at Visigoth. The I is a 1, the O is a 0. What's your social medias?
You can find the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at the Alexander Society Pod and on Twitter at Alex Society Pod. If you enjoyed what you've heard today, please give us a rate and review on your streaming service of choice.
Bye.